ये रेडियो पाकिस्तान पॉडकास्ट है।
Assalamu alaikum listeners and viewers, welcome to the Environment Channel of Radio Pakistan. This is your host Taghreed Iftikhar and I have with me Zainab Waheed. Let's welcome her on the show. Assalamu alaikum Zainab.
Walaikum assalam, Taghreed. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, of course, my pleasure. Zainab Waheed is an 18-year-old Pakistani youth climate activist and journalist. She has represented Pakistan in 3 international conferences in Argentina, Italy, and US. She's also Pakistan's representative to the UN Youth Force. Zainab is a UNICEF Foresight Fellow. She has also represented Pakistan to UNICEF South Asia. She was selected as Pakistan's official delegate to the C40 World Mayors Summit and Youth for Climate pre-COP summits of 2022 and 2021. Wow, Zainab. That is a whole lot of introduction. So Zainab, tell me about your journey. How did you get involved with climate change and why did you feel the need to do so?
Okay, first of all, thank you so much for the very generous introduction. I'm honored. And I think I've been in this field for the past 4 to 5 years. I started when I was 13 and the German embassy in Pakistan involved me in an awareness competition, and from there on it was gradual study and observation. I published over 30 climate articles, op-eds talking about climate internationally and nationally and locally with madrasa girls. I teach them about climate. And so I think it was with gradual study and observation that I came to realize how serious of an issue climate change was and how little action was being taken on it in the current scenarios. And so I think it's really important for all young people who have the resources, who have access to social media, to mainstream media, and who are lucky enough to get formal education in Pakistan to do their part and spread this climate education to as many people as they can. Because if we are not talking about climate change, the governors, the people who are in authorities, our governments, policymakers, they're never going to take climate action. I think it is people power, the power of the people, the power of our protests, our chants, the placards that we hold that really has the dynamic power to push for change where governments and institutions refuse to or either fail to.
Okay. Zainab, we all know what is climate change and how it has affected Pakistan and the world globally. Tell me who are the major contributors towards climate change in Pakistan and globally as well?
The answer is really simple. It's the global northern countries which are developed today and also the fossil fuels industries. So the global northern countries colonized global southern countries historically. They plundered our resources, built up industries and factories, and those that process of industrialization emitted so much carbon emissions that we artificially accelerated the natural process of climate change. And so the climate impacts that we're seeing now are anthropogenic. They're caused by humans, which and the point that we're on right now, this would have been the case with natural climate change centuries from this point on, but we've accelerated it artificially. And so those most responsible are the global northern countries that also own and subsidize fossil fuels industries regularly, and the fossil fuels industry sector, the energy sector basically, is the primary entity responsible for the major part of the carbon emissions, over 70% of them.
All right, Zainab. Last year, Pakistan faced floods. There was economic devastation. People's lives were lost. Livestock was affected, and there was just so much devastation overall. And we have seen the impacts of climate change. What do you think Pakistan should do, and what has Pakistan done so far to combat climate change?
Pakistan's representation in COP27 was better than it was last year, and we're hoping that COP28's representation of Pakistan will also be good. We also had a standalone conference called the Geneva Conference earlier this year, so I think Pakistan's progress on talking about climate change and demanding climate action has been better than it has been in the last 2 decades with the previous governments. But we also hope that the representation does not stay where it is. It also amplifies further, and we hope that we will move towards solid climate solutions in the form of climate finance and accountability measures for climate action. So I think so far we've had a major plantation called the 10 billion tree tsunami project. We've had plantations and also advocacy on the government level, but we need to go a step further. Not a step further. We have a lot of milestones to cover before we actually achieve climate justice.
Yeah, Zainab, what we know that COP28 is going to be in a month or so. What should be Pakistan's stance at COP28?
It should primarily be climate finance securing it, and also pushing for an official definition of climate finance. So at the current moment there is no definition of climate finance, which gives climate criminals the free space to decide on whatever they report as climate finance. They can also give loans and sell climate insurance to global southern countries in the name of climate finance and report it however they want. There are no set mechanisms for not only defining but also the delivery of climate finance. And so I think that's really important. Without deciding which, we can have hundreds of conferences, we can have hundreds of seminars, but without any real achievement. This fundamentally needs to be addressed before we move forward. We need to define what climate finance exactly is, what does and does not count as climate finance. Grants do count, but I don't think loans should. Because in a climate-stricken country, the repayments on not only insurance but also loans, they account up to be more than the actual damage caused by climate change to those countries.
We don't have the funds to give back the loans.
Yes, and the amount of the loans amplifies up to a level that's way more than our actual damage as well, which basically raises questions about the validity of climate justice and climate finance as well. If it's supposed to help us, why is it burdening us more? And so climate finance should be the priority, and apart from that, also putting first-hand climate victims on policy making tables and removing language barriers from them, making sure underrepresented groups such as women and indigenous people, not only from Pakistan but also from across global south, they're equitably represented, they're assisted with everything that they need to put their point across. Because I think a fundamental part of climate injustice is also the lack of access, not only because of lack of media but also the language barriers. So a person from Balochistan who's lost their homes and their families and their livelihoods because of climate change should not be expected to first learn English to understand what's happened to them. They should be able to access climate education in their own language without doing the extra effort of learning another language, just so they can understand what's happened to them.
That was a very good point, Zainab, that you mentioned, that we need to have first-hand climate victims on all of these platforms. I also think that mental aspect is also need to be addressed, because imagine you're living your normal day-to-day life and then floods hit you and then your life is displaced. You don't have any school to go, and then you don't have any shelter, there's no food. So imagine the mental state of the victim.
Yes.
So I really agree to that point. Also, Zainab, you talked that there's no definition of climate finance. So who is going to define climate finance, the global north or the global south?
I think it has to be a collaborative effort between both, but it sounds really cliche when I sit here and talk about collaboration, I talk about inclusivity, I use cliched words. It sounds boring. We've heard these terms many times before. We've talked about how the global south needs to work with global north. We've also heard about the arguments of each one of these entities against each other, but I think it's really important to talk about how the global north, since it's responsible for causing climate change, it should not have the entire authority to define the terms on which rehabilitation will take place, and global southern countries do not have the capacities and the resources to equitably and accurately define all of these things by themselves. So a collaboration has to be done. It is imperative for accountability.
All right, Zainab. The global north is transitioning towards green energy. They have the funds, they have the economic stability. So how can the countries like Pakistan or global south can make that transition even more smooth?
For a person in Sindh who lives in Thar and talks about and hears about the coal fields that are being discovered over there, and also the development on through coal, it sounds exciting to them, probably because they do not understand the impacts that it will have 30 years down the lane. But we also need to understand that countries like Pakistan already suffer so much from their inflation, from their economic vows, that they do not have have the capacity to put off their development in the short term and wait for an eventual green transition. So climate finance is important if the global north wants to accelerate a transition, a green transition in developing countries as well. And while we're on that topic, we also need to understand that this green transition is not really just, because it amplifies the inequalities that already exist in the form of child labor, in form of the loss of cultures and identities and languages and economies in the global south. So for example, the cobalt, the lithium, the minerals needed to make and construct these renewable energies, they have to be extracted in the exact same manner as coal and oil. And so it really raises questions about the validity of doing all of this
green
effort.
energy really green?
Is it really green? And also, so for example, for a particular mineral, if a whole river has to be drained in Colombia before researchers have the access to the bed of the river to extract all of those minerals, is it really worth it? What about all of the animals and people that rely on that water?
The ecological disturbance that they're creating over there.
The ecological disturbance as well, and also the legal lawsuits that will be filed that the people do not have money to fight. So all of this raises questions about the validity of green energies, and if it is doing more harm than good with us moving towards it.
All right, Zainab, one last question is, what do you want to say to the people who are so hopeless with the current situation of climate change and they don't see any future?
I do not blame them. I get the frustration. It is really easy to get lost in your own thoughts and in despair when I see people dying in my country and then global northern countries living in the finest hotels when they attend climate conferences and having the finest meals. And so I think this barrier of luxury that those responsible for climate change live in, and this barrier of luxury which stops them from actual climate action, is really frustrating, because I think luxury is the major obstacle to any real action. If I am sitting in an air-conditioned room, I will never be able to feel what a laborer goes through when they work 12 hours a day in broad sunlight in Pakistan's heat. So I think this barrier of luxury needs to be removed. In a recent activity I did for UNICEF, I imagined a world 40 years from now where global leaders live with climate victims at climate conferences, where climate conferences are not held in fancy expo centers, they're not held in fancy hotels, they're held amidst climate catastrophes. And I imagined a world where in a flooded city of Larkana, Pakistan hosts a COP38 10 years from now, where global leaders live in tents and feed on the morsels from international aid, and then only they can really understand what people go through. I think I am diverting from the topic, but you asked me what my message is for people who suffer. I think I get them, but also we need to keep our voices high and our demands consistent, because if right now 1% of the population is talking about climate change with all their heart, and still the inaction on climate change is so poignant, imagine what will happen if 0% of the population is talking about it. Policymakers will have a free hand to not take climate action at all. And so I think in order to prevent that, and in order to ensure that our voices are heard, we need to keep raising our voices.
We have to make sure that our voices are there, even if they're not that loud.
Yes.
That they
because
will be
it
heard.
Does make a difference, because while us talking about climate change might not be reducing carbon emissions directly, it is making an impact by making sure people know about it, and 10 years down the line they will demand climate action from the people that they vote for.
We have started talking about climate change, and I'm hopeful that action is going to be taken in the next years. We can only hope for a better future. Thank you so much for tuning into the Radio Pakistan podcast. Stay tuned for another episode. Thank you so much, Zainab, for coming on the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Taghreed.
All right, take care. Allah Hafiz.
ये रेडियो पाकिस्तान पॉडकास्ट है।